Right, fellas, we are continuing with the nervous system today. So, hopefully, at this stage, you have practiced drawing your motor neurons, your sensory neurons, your interneurons, and you should be able to answer all of these questions here. So, what you'll do is you'll pause the video. I will go through these answers here for these questions on what you should know, and then you could correct yourself as we go. Okay, so I'm going to start correcting now. What is a neuron? A neuron is a nerve cell. Okay, that's how we define it. Name the three different types of neurons. So you have the motor neuron, the sensory neuron, and the interneuron. How are neurons specially adapted to carry impulses? Okay, so there's two kind of things you could talk about here. You could talk about the fact that a neuron has a myelin sheath, myelin sheath, sheath. And the myelin sheath is something that insulates the nerve impulse, so it insulates the neuron and prevents the impulse from leaving the axon. Okay, you could also say that the axon is a good conductor of electricity. That'd be another thing you could mention, or you could actually mention other things as well, like for example, the fact that the terminal dendrites have something called the synaptic knob, which has neurotransmitters that carry the impulse from neuron to neuron. So there's a few different things you could talk about there. So I suppose the special adaptations really come into the fact that it's quite an abnormal cell. Like, it looks quite different to most cells that we have around the body. Anyways, can you sketch a motor neuron? So when you drew out your motor neuron, you should find that the cell body is on the left of the diagram. And out of that cell body, you've got dendrons and you've got dendrites. Okay. The next thing then is, what's the difference between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system? So the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system includes all the other neurons that branch out of the central nervous system. Okay, so today's focus really is on the following. We're going to try to distinguish between the different types of neurons again. Okay, so we're going to look at their properties and see what makes them unique. We're going to talk about messages that are carried around the body. Now remember, messages technically are electrochemical impulses. Okay, then we're talking about the different parts of the brain. If we have time, we'll see how we get on, and we'll see how far we get in this. Okay, now, so motor neurons and sensory neurons again. You know at this stage that motor neurons carry impulses from the central nervous system to effectors, but you may not have a clue what an effector actually is. Okay, so the word effector is kind of something that we say that brings about kind of a response. An effector would be, like, for example, a muscle or a gland. The example I gave yesterday was the salivary gland. Okay, inside in your mouth, you have salivary gland at the roof and the bottom of your mouth. And that gland is being stimulated to produce salivary amylase and saliva, the liquid part, as well. So when your body is working effectively, what's happening there is your motor neurons are carrying impulses from the central nervous system to the effectors, which bring about that response. Another example I gave you yesterday was where we talked about the skin, and let's say, for argument's sake, it's very, very cold outside. So the effector is going to be the hair follicle, okay, which is going to stand upright. So that's the first definition you absolutely need to know. Motor neurons will carry impulses from the central nervous system to effectors. You need to know what an effector is. You'll be asked to define this as well. Effectors are muscles or glands. Now, that brings us on to the sensory neurons, and you might remember the definition for the sensory neurons, that they bring impulses from the sense organs to the central nervous system. Okay, so the sense organs, remember, we 5 of them. We have the nose, the skin, the tongue, the eyes, the ears. Okay, and you've obviously got your different senses as well. We talked about that when we did the sensory system. Now, I suppose another disease there you might be associated there with motor neurons disease. This guy here, Stephen Hawking, had motor neurons disease, so you might be familiar there. That's a problem here where the motor neurons are not carrying the impulses effectively to the effectors. So there's going to be a problem here, particularly at the synapse. Tends to be a problem here at the synapse of the motor neurons. Rather, motor neurons are over here, sorry. So this is the motor neuron, we have the cell body on the left, and this is the sensory neuron, we have the cell body along the axon, okay? Right, so I've mentioned that, and there's enough done now on that, and now we'll talk about the sensory neuron and how exactly does it work. So remember that the sensory neuron is carrying an impulse from the sense organ to the central nervous system. That's what it does. So, for example, we talked about excretion recently. So let's look at the example of excretion. In the skin, we recognize that there were sensory cells, and these are known as sense receptors. Okay, so receptor cells. So these are just branching here into the upper layers of the skin. And these are here to detect something called a stimulus. Okay, a stimulus is like, for example, something that brings about a response. So, like, for example, pain receptors. So there could be a pain receptor there that detects pain. So if you're being pinched or something, then you know that the receptors are going to detect that, and they're going to carry a message, an impulse, from the sensory organ, which is your skin, up to your central nervous system, which is your brain and spinal cord. Okay, the plural for stimulus is stimuli. Okay, and then it's important to remember that these receptors are located in all of your sense organs, and we've looked at this already. We talked about thermoreceptors, which are found in your skin. We talked about pain receptors found in your skin. We talked about chemoreceptors in your tongue and your nose, and we talked about photoreceptors in your eyes. Okay, so this allows you to detect and have stimuli, and therefore have senses. So when these receptors detect something, what they do is they're going to carry an impulse. And this impulse, remember, is going to be carried by two things. It's going to be carried by the electrical part, which effectively is the movement of what we call ions. Okay, so electricity is the movement of electrons. So it's the movement here of ions, really. The second thing then is the chemical part, which is where we talk about neurotransmitters, where the chemicals carrying it from one neuron onto the next neuron. Okay, so hopefully that's okay with you. I don't know, do you have any questions on that so far? But let's comment underneath, please, if you have any questions. So the next thing then is questions that would come up would ask you, what are the key differences between the different types of neurons? Okay, so you might know here anyway, the obvious part that we looked at so far was the fact that the cell body has a different location in the motor neuron compared to the sensory neuron. So, like in the example of the motor neuron, we know the cell body is found on the end of the neuron, and it was here on the left. And difference here in the sensory neuron, the cell body is found along the sensory neuron. Okay, so what are other differences are there? Well, if you think about the definition of what a motor neuron and a sensory neuron are, so a motor neuron carries an impulse from the central nervous system to the effectors. So that's going to be one difference there, because the sensory neuron will carry impulses in the other direction from the sensory organs to the central nervous system. Remember, an effector is a gland or a muscle. We talked about this, and one other difference here actually as well is the dendrites tend to be quite short in the motor neuron. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it, because the motor neuron is only carrying the impulse from the central nervous system to the effectors or the glands. The sensory neurons, however, have to detect the sensation, okay, of, we'll say, pain or temperature or, chemicals, and there's a threshold there that they have to look at. So it makes sense that they would have longer dendrites there to detect the sensation. Okay, the third neuron, as we talked about, is the interneuron, which carries impulses between neurons, between the motor neuron and the sensory neuron, and that's mainly found in the central nervous system. Okay, so remember we looked at that the cell body there is found in the middle of that neuron. Okay, so hopefully everything there is okay with you so far, carrying impulse between neurons. The next thing then is, how does the nervous system work? Well, the best comparison we can use for the nervous system is like the domino effect. Okay, so imagine here we have dominoes set up, and along buzzes a fly, and the fly manages to hit the domino. Now, if the fly has hit it hard enough, then what's going to happen here is that the first domino is going to fall, right? So, in other words, the once the first domino falls, it's going to pass it from domino to domino to domino to domino, all the way through the um, the nervous system. So, if we compare the dominoes here, let's pretend the first domino here represents the sensory receptor, okay, which is a sensory neuron. It detects that the when the fly hits the domino, and it's going to pass it on to the, if you think about the destination, where it's going to go, it's going to go to the central nervous system. Okay, now when the first domino, if the domino is going to set off this kind of message, the domino has to get so much energy. Okay, so energy is required for it to kind of fall over, right? So it needs so much energy to fall over, and we call this the threshold level. Okay, we can use this comparison to explain, how much, or like how we respond, and when we don't respond to different kind of stimuli, we'll say. Okay, so every stimulus must have met a certain threshold for a message to be passed on. Otherwise, we would be sending on unnecessary messages. Okay. So, say for example, now let's look at the example of a thermoreceptor. Okay, so your body has to decide all the time whether it's going to, try to keep in heat or try to lose heat. So on a day like today now, for example, it's not very warm. So maybe if you're feeling a little bit cold, then your thermoreceptors are going to detect that temperature around you. Okay, but they won't like cause the response, and we know the response is when you're cold that the hair follicles will stand up, you'll trap air underneath your skin, and that'll insulate you, and your blood vessels will constrict away from the surface. All of those effects won't happen unless a message was sent from your thermoreceptors to your central nervous system to say um, that you need to keep the heat in, you need to insulate yourself. So what's going to happen there is that the temperature must reach a certain level. So, like, say for example, now it's your body feels cold, and maybe it's 10 degrees Celsius outside, and you're not wearing a jumper. So the threshold level has been reached. You're feeling really cold, and the first domino falls, and it's going to pass on the message until your central nervous system. So this threshold level is really, really important, because every single part of your nervous system is based on the threshold level, and we call this the all or nothing threshold. Okay, so if the threshold was not reached, then there will be no response. So, like, if your body is perfectly fine and you don't feel cold, then you will not pass on a message to your brain to say, "I'm cold. I must have my hair follicles stand up straight to catch the air," and your blood vessels will not move in any direction. And that's because the threshold was not reached. But if the threshold was reached, then that we call it the all scenario, where basically the energy is passed on and the electrochemical message will be passed on until your brain to bring about the response. Okay, so you can relate this to every single stimulus out there, whether it's pain, temperature, chemicals, smell, it's all there. Okay, so you need to learn about this. If a stimulus is not sufficiently strong to trigger a sense receptor, there will be no response. That's the nothing scenario. If a stimulus is sufficiently strong to trigger a sense receptor, there will be a response. Okay, so again, you need to define a stimulus and a response. Remember, a stimulus is what brings about a response. A response is caused by a stimulus. Now, what else do I have mentioned here? Okay, once the stimulus is above the threshold level, it will always be carried no matter how strong the stimulus. And yes, that's again because of the all scenario. The message is sent regardless. Okay, and this situation here, the same mechanism could send a mild impulse for an itch or a strong impulse for pain. Again, the impulse is going to be sent once the threshold has been reached. Here's a definition you need to know. This definition will come up in the nervous system. So a threshold is the minimum stimulation required to send a message along a neuron. You just need to learn that off. Okay, so the minimum stimulation required to send a message along a neuron. Now, if we talk about, and this is where I asked you to try to read up a little bit about something called transmission, which is like how the electrochemical messages pass along your nervous system. So remember, we're carrying the impulse between neurons. So neurons are kind of lined along here all the way from your sense organ until your brain, okay? And we need to pass the message here through the dendrites as an electrical message. And once we get to the synaptic knobs, we then need to pass it as an as a chemical message with a neurotransmitter onto the next neuron. Okay, to do that, we have to get across what we call the synaptic cleft. Okay, the synaptic cleft, you can imagine here, like the comparison I would like to use here would be like the Grand Canyon. Okay, you need to get yourself from one side of the Grand Canyon across the other side of the Grand Canyon. To do that, you have to use a neurotransmitter. There's no other way. Okay, so the neurotransmitter is a chemical that will carry a chemical message across a synapse. Okay, the synapse is where the two neurons will meet. Now, there's an awful lot of terminology here. I know you just need to learn it off. Okay, so because that we have a electrical impulse and because we have a chemical carrying it across here, we know that the nervous system relies on electrochemical messages. That's what we call it. Okay, so there's two different examples, acetylcholine and dopamine. Dopamine is a good one to remember because you'll all be familiar with dopamine scandals. Okay, so what you need to be able to do here is explain specifically what happens. And you pretty much know how to explain this already. Okay, so what do we know already? The dendrites here, if we're talking about, I just have sensory neurons here now in this example. But, so remember the sensory neurons now here. Let's imagine here these sensory neurons here are in our sense organ, like for example, our skin. So they have long dendrites here to catch to basically have sense receptors. So if we're talking here in relation, let's talk about temperature, thermoreceptors. So let's say the terminal receptors are here. Okay, the thermoreceptors here are sensory neurons, and these dendrites are quite long in the sensory neuron to catch the sensation of temperature. Okay, and once the all or nothing threshold has been met, so we have now got an all scenario where the first domino has fallen and therefore has passed on an electrical impulse along here. So what you'd say here is that dendrites have have reached the all or nothing threshold. They're passing on an electrical impulse here along the axon, which is being insulated by the myelin sheath. It's been passed along here until it reaches the terminal dendrites, which have synaptic knobs. At the synaptic knobs, we know that we have neurotransmitters like dopamine, which are going to carry the impulse across here as an electrochemical message, so passing it onto the dendrites of the next neuron, in this case, which is a sensory neuron. And then that pretty much covers here the most of it. Is there anything I'm missing there? So we have the all or nothing threshold. We talked about that. We talked about the terminal dendrite. We talked about the synaptic knob. Talked about the neurotransmitters like the dopamine. We talked about going across the synapse. We talked about starting again at the next neuron. The one thing I forgot to mention here was that the enzymes release, which break down neurotransmitters so their product can be used again. So the sixth part there, we're reusing neurotransmitters. It's kind of like an enzyme. It's pretty much used over and over and over and over again. So we have to break down neurotransmitters with the enzymes. Okay, so hopefully you can explain that now. And again, you should be able to explain this with any any stimuli. Okay, whether it's pain like this poor fella here with his nettles stings, okay, or temperature or hearing or sight, it doesn't matter. Whatever the receptor is, whether it's a photoreceptor, thermoreceptor, mechanoreceptor, you should be able to explain that and how they work. Okay, this is like a close-up image here of the end of two neurons. Okay, so this would be the terminal dendrites onto the dendrite of the next neuron. We can see here this is the synapse because the two of these neurons are meeting, and this is known as the synaptic cleft because this is the gap between the two. So we can see here that the direction is from left to right anyway, because we know that because it goes from terminal dendrites onto the next dendrites of the next neuron. And we know that we have a neurotransmitter here, which is being broken down by enzymes once it has passed the message across. Now, what we'll be talking about soon is like a reflex action and like voluntary action. Okay, so what we're talking about here is electrochemical message will continue its journey to the central nerve and may trigger a reflex action. So again, that's the next lesson about reflex action. Remember, is like where, like for example, you touch a nettle, you know your hand moves away before you even think about it. It's not a voluntary response; it's involuntary. You're doing it without thinking. And then we're going to trigger response, which is for a lot of people, if it's we're talking about nettles, we're talking about pain. So like you remove your hand because it's painful, and that's protecting you there. Okay. Now, this is another definition that you'll be aware of. And for physics students, it might actually be a little bit easier to remember because the refractory period here is a slight delay between one message and the next. And refraction, if you think about it, is like how, refraction is like when, we'll say, light goes through a object and its direction is changed slightly. So that'll be a nice way to remember this one here, because the refractory period means there is a slight delay here between one message and the next. Okay, the message to the brain and the message back to say remove your hand. So there's a slight delay there, really slight in time. Okay, so that's for pain, for eyes, etc. Now, let's see if you can match these up. So this will be your work for me for the next day. You might just comment underneath the video, guys, and see can you match all of these, and I will go through the solutions tomorrow. So for example, if you look here at, for example, effectors, what would effectors match here based on what we just discussed? Effectors would match, tree would match with C. They are glands or muscles. That is true. Okay, you have to match the rest of these, and basically based on the terminology I've introduced today, see can you do it. Okay, so that's it for today. We'll talk to you later.